This video is brought to you by RockLock, the universal quick change strap lock. Perfect for rapidly swapping your favorite straps between guitars, even if the strap buttons are in different positions, as it will take me longer to finish this sentence than it takes to flip the orientation of a RockLock. While your guitar is being protected from accidental drops, its finish is also being protected by the included pads. Never fret about a dropped guitar, installing aftermarket strap buttons, or shelling out the big bucks for incompatible proprietary locking systems. Check out the affordable RockLock at the link below. Hey everybody, Ryan here. Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, and after many months and much popular demand, gear Curiosities, with today's subject being the infamous Boss Katana. The Boss Katana platform has been out in the wild for the better part of a decade at this point, as painful as that is to say, and in multiple generations now. In fact, this is the latest Mark III, though a lot of what I want to be talking about does carry over from the Mark II generation, and even a lot of it from the Mark I. And because of that, I haven't really felt the urgent need to make a video on this series. A lot of people have beaten me to the punch, as is usually the case, and I think a lot of what needs to be said and talked about is out there. But coming from a particular viewpoint on amp modeling hardware and kind of looking at it through a budget-focused lens and kind of a retrospective lens at the same time, and the fact that a few of you would not let it go that I've not made a Katana video yet, here you go. You've strong-armed me into this series, or at least into a video, and you know what? I'm glad that I had some time to spend with this, because I would say that there is definitely room to grow with this platform. It doesn't do everything. It is obvious that this is not their flagship, modeling. We've got the GT line. You have certain technologies that just are not in the core amplifier architecture. It's not in the effects. And there's a lot of things that I feel like are easy, low-hanging fruit that Boss could grab for future generations, and I think a lot of that is on purpose. I think they're leaving some stuff on the table just to be able to grow and expand and resell this stuff. But with the price that these things go for, it's nothing short of a triumph. And looking at it from someone who had, the Marshall MG series growing up, this $400 MSRP amp head, or especially the 350 to 550 range, 1x12, 2x12 Boss Katana amplifiers, just makes that MG platform look like a fucking dinosaur. It's not even a contest. And I would have been ecstatic to own something like this when I was, 13, 15, even 18 years old, getting to grips with some of my favorite tones, because while not everything is covered here, you're not going to get the most articulate, crazy metal amp tones in the world, but with some of the help of effects and boosters under the hood, you can make a lot of cool amp sounds. And I think ultimately it's a platform that for most people, it's going to do more than you need it to. And when paired up with other auxiliary gear, you can get a pretty killer value rig. And I think for me, that's why I gravitated towards the head immediately. Just recently, I saw like a little country cover band playing in a local bar and grill, and the guitar player was rocking, I think it was a Mark II from what I could tell, but one of these heads through like a 2x12 Carvin with V30s. Sounded great. Chatted to him about it for a moment. And, it's not the first time I've seen a Katana employed in cover band situations. But for me, I think being able to bring your own cab, especially if you already have something, is really the secret sauce to this stuff. And you'll be able to hear what this thing is capable of direct. I think that's also a big selling point with all the Katana stuff. But given the form factor, given the fact that this thing does have integrated speakers that aren't complete trash that you can practice through, given that you can expand into a second amplifier with the stereo expand function, which we're not even going to be going into today, I just think this is such a high value cornerstone to a budget rig. It just makes perfect sense to me. And I think it's going to serve the purpose of almost every lower level beginner to intermediate, even beyond guitar player out there. Again, I wish they had something like this when I was looking for my amplifier, because it was kind of one or the other. You either had to get a stupid, multi-effects unit and be more knowledgeable about it than I was at the time and be able to 4-cable method and all that stuff, or you had, a brand that's recognizable and a decent sounding 2x12, and it didn't do everything I wanted it to do, whereas it's kind of the best of both worlds now. Beyond the head and the matching cabinets, you have other form factors like the Mini and the Air, and of course the Artist, which as far as I can tell basically has all the same functionality as the head, just with higher quality speakers, and there's a couple shortcut buttons and connectivity things that are lacking on this, like the ability to more easily switch between channels 5 through 8 from 1 through 4, and of course the controls are front facing on this thing. So if that's something that you value and it makes sense for you to spend a little bit more to have stuff like that for the extra connectivity, to have, some of these, what I would consider more higher end pro features, then maybe that's something that's worth looking at for you. But again, I'm kind of going into this video with the premise that I think this really is the sweet spot of the Katana range. Again, it's going to make total sense for a lot of people to go straight into the 1x12 or especially the 2x12. I think upgrading the speakers is not really the value proposition though. And I feel like the open back cabinets really is the bottleneck for a lot of the sounds that I've heard out of the combo. I've not really gelled with the combo ever playing it. Of course, it's not using my guitar, so that's half the battle, but I've never really liked what I got out of those amplifiers, especially the higher gain stuff when sitting down and trying them. But being able to mess with this in my own room, having, the USB connectivity and being able to mess with the virtual microphones and the types of character switches that are on board with this thing have made this a lot more convincing in my use case. And I think there's really a use case to just buy one of these as your all-in-one kind of desktop amp modeler. Before you get too stoked on that idea though, I think it's imperative that I cover what I feel is the biggest lacking aspect of the Katana series. And this probably isn't going to shock you if you've ever plugged a Boss product or Roland product into a PC or Mac and try to use it that way. That is the Boss Tone Studio software. It's not terrible, and while it may be lacking some of the contemporary GUI elements and things that I like so much about stuff from, let's say, Fractal Audio or even Helix Native, this thing is just buggy, outright buggy sometimes. It's quirky even when it does work correctly, and it just feels like their applications are, 15, 20 years behind the times. And I don't necessarily want it to look a different way, or, I don't want them to copy off of something else, but if it is working better, maybe you should take a hint. Some of my biggest complaints really is even when it is working smoothly, the transfer times of certain things like moving your presets back and forth from the PC to this unit are sometimes abysmally slow. It seems that going to the unit isn't so bad, but riding from the amp to your PC or Mac is like laughably slow, which makes no sense because this thing is connected over USB, and that USB Type-C is capable of being a two-way audio interface. So if it can do that in real time, why does file transfer take so long? Like, what kind of ancient flash storage is on this thing? It makes me think it has nothing to do with hardware. It makes me think it's completely programming. I don't have proof of that, but experience tells me that's probably the case. The overall GUI when it comes to controlling the virtual amplifier panel is not bad whatsoever, but the signal chain is a little odd because you see, this isn't like Pod Go where you have X number of free blocks and you can move them around and some of them are stationary. And this certainly isn't like Fractal Audio systems where you have a blank canvas, an infinite number of combinations of signal chain blocks. And it's really not 100% like a Kemper either, where they're all kind of fixed and in place. This is somewhere in between all of them, and it becomes a little frustrating as a result. You might look at this and go, well, actually, isn't it kind of cool that I can take this booster and move it after the effects if I wanted the, maybe this to be a modulation or a compressor and move this over here, or that, I can take this delay and move it over here. And that is great, but there are certain combinations where it just doesn't work that smoothly, and there's no apparent reason why other than the GUI isn't letting you. So for instance, there'll be times where, let's say I want to move delay over here, I want to move effects over here, and sometimes it just won't cooperate, or it will only let you put the effects before this EQ, but at the same time you can put this EQ over here. There's certain weird limitations that it makes it feel like, well, if you can do that, why can't you just put every block everywhere? You know what I mean? Like, I can't just take this reverb and move it. You can't move it at all. Reverb and this delay too is always at the end, which I guess kind of makes sense, but it would be nice to have the spring reverb in front of the clean amplifier for a little bit more, authenticity for some Fender tones. But it's just simply not as drag and drop as you might think it should be. Because like I said, maybe it makes sense that booster should be up front, but modulation sometimes acts weird. Like, check this out. Trying to move mod. And in theory, you should just be able to take this anywhere, right? And I do have signal chains where modulation is at the end, or at least it's after the amplifier. And yet here, it's like I have to move effects first. Sometimes it doesn't even want to cooperate there, and then modulation will go with it. Why is it has to be mod then effects and not effects then mod when you can basically access the same stuff underneath? Weird shit like that drives me crazy. Once you get into the effects, the GUI isn't exactly the most inspiring thing ever. It works okay. Some of the visual representations aren't exactly my favorite when going between, say 125 hertz and 630 hertz, just being different positions on this semicircle here. It works. It's just not exactly inspired, and it's not something that I would expect to be the center point of their development. For me, this whole platform is very much set it up, and then once you're done, that's your tone, and then don't think about it again. But don't expect to be necessarily inspired by the workflow. It's totally acceptable for something like an MD500 modulation pedal or equivalent reverb pedal, but for a full-blown amp modeling rig modeler like this, I think there needs to be more attention into just the way this works. Now, it's my understanding that the artist has a little bit better software, and there's plenty of like third-party apps that you can more easily move the signal chain around, but I'm going to be looking at this as most people are going to use it, which is with the OEM stuff. Now, that's when the software is working, because there's a whole other list of problems that I've encountered or things that just don't make sense. Now, if I were to hit the panel button on this thing right now, there's about a 8 out of 10 chance that this will brick the entire amplifier and I have to power cycle it. Because for whatever reason, I've encountered this when moving presets to and from the unit as well, especially if I reload all 8 channels. It will just get hung up perpetually and no buttons work here. And even though you press these for whatever reason, the rest of the signal chain doesn't respond. It makes really no sense to me whatsoever. It's like, what about that panel move made this freak out? And that made recording really frustrating, because basically every time that I would switch the channels around, put new sounds in them, I'd have to power cycle this thing and like close my Cubase project and start over again. At least one aspect of that issue could be circumvented if they would just allow you to have more freaking tones on this thing at the same time. Now, for most people, especially with a live gig or a cover band, 8 sounds is probably enough, or especially if you broke it up into 2 sets and did 16, and in the middle of your set you transferred some tones over, especially if you had like the Bluetooth capable stuff. Okay, whatever, not the biggest deal in the world. But what I don't understand is how you have enough processing power and memory to hold a fairly complex signal chain like that, but not enough onboard storage to hold more than 8 presets. It doesn't make any sense to me. Storage is basically negligible when it comes to cost. And again, I feel like it's one of those things where they're artificially limiting the capability of this stuff to sell other products. It's like, well, if you want 16 or 32 or how many ever banks or presets, you gotta, go with the Boss GT series and or have the next tone stuff or, whatever. And I just feel like it's contrived. It's really contrived. I mean, I bring up the original Pod series probably too much, but even that shit had 9 banks and 4 presets per bank. You could get 36 sounds out of it. And again, I get it's more limited in terms of the signal chain, but if they could do that back then, there's no reason this thing should only have 8. Now, I understand it's probably a matter of being able to get to them, but just add 2 buttons to cycle bank up and down. They could do that on the foot switch. It doesn't make sense why they got this far. It's like 99% there, and they just didn't add one little small feature. I mean, hell, just give me a USB port. I could plug a freaking flash drive in. I'd be happy with that. As it stands, though, this just makes the whole live set layout and workflows feel kind of disconnected from the way that you're actually probably going to use this amp. Again, it is capable enough to where I feel like it could warrant having 50, 60 presets on board or more. But when you only have 8, I'm very much in the mindset of like, well, why should I make more than 8 then? Or maybe have one set for this and one set for that. But I think with what I made for the video, it's kind of a frustrating number that I would not want to keep up with and transfer back and forth if I was using this thing to, record or practice. Before I spend an obnoxious amount of time covering the amplifier and effects tones, let's go over the top panel controls and the connectivity features of the Katana head. And some of these things I'll point out are definitely new to the Mark III. Some of them are carryovers from Mark II. And as I see it, I think that makes the Mark II and Mark III worthwhile upcharges over a Mark I. If you're cross-shopping this stuff used, I would personally rather pay a little bit less for a Mark II used versus, spending a lot more on a Mark III brand new. But if there's a couple features that really catch your eye, then, these things have been out long enough. I think you could find a used Mark III specimen like I did. Hell, I got this thing like shipped here $100 under MSRP and it's practically perfect shape. So it's doable. But again, I think a lot of the 80 for 20 value does lie in the Mark II, even if it is missing a couple features that I really like on this thing. So starting with the rear panel, you'll see that a majority of the staple connectivity features you would expect are there with things like an effects loop, obviously a speaker out. You got expression pedal in for stuff like volume and wah pedals. You have the foot switch that you could purchase, even third party, use a different one if it's a tip ring sleeve type of setup. But there's also a couple things that maybe you wouldn't expect out of something at this cost. And I also think this lends it to being a high value purchase if you plan to use this in more than one way. For example, the power amp in, you could basically use this as kind of a master power amp. If you wanted to feed an entirely different multi-effects unit into this thing, keep this in a rehearsal space, make it pull double duty, whatever, I think this is something I'm going to personally explore in the near future just to see how this power amp reacts. And based off of the way it reacts with the onboard stuff, I presume it's going to be a pretty decent Class D type of solid state power amp sound. You also have this stereo extend option, which obviously I don't have a second unit to play with, but from what I can tell, you can basically make another unit a slave and have all the controls and all the sounds off of this thing go into there in a stereo form factor. So you could have, 2 cabs really far apart, and all of these stereo effects that this thing has will carry over to that, and you'll get that wide stereo image, ping pong delay, that sort of thing. And while that would not be my recommendation in terms of how to spend your money, it is cool that you could do that, especially if you had, a buddy that has one of these, like, hey, can I borrow this for a show or whatever? And then you've got, a full stereo rig, which is pretty cool. But I think really if you're going to go that route, you could get a really good sound direct doing the same thing. And I feel like with the amount of stereo effects on here, or more accurately, the lack of stereo capability in a lot of the really important effects models that I like, I don't really think it's worthwhile buying another one just for that. The head does have the capability to use Bluetooth if you buy the adapter, take off this little cover, plug that in. Of course, I'm not exploring that because for me, the real winner of this feature set is the USB Type-C. And as you can see underneath, it does indeed say stereo recording out, which is exactly how I ended up recording this entire video. And I did try out of the line out. I did try out of the headphones out. The line out is mono, so you're going to lose out on the stuff that I think it does a good job on with the stereo capability, and the headphone output is a little noisy going into an audio interface. It's not the end of the world, but I think if you're going to buy this thing and record with it and use it as kind of a budget audio interface, once again, there's like another $50, $100+ that this has saved you. And as long as you're just using headphones, it's like it makes perfect sense. So not only can you use this as just a straight recording interface, basically recording the amp output of this or the direct sound output, you can even have your tracks come in. So I didn't even need to use my reamp box. This was the reamp box with all of the tracks coming in, all my dry guitars, and then you get the wet sound coming out. Now, with that, it's a little bit different than the way I like to use it most of the time, as you can't really monitor a separate track. You're just monitoring this thing. So as long as you can get around that workflow, then it's probably going to work for you. But once again, it's one of those things, it's like, man, they just saved another $80, $100, for a reamp box, and it's all totally clean. Now, of course, to get those dry tracks in there to begin with, you'd have to record through this thing and use the secondary outputs that are completely dry. And there's a potential, I suppose, that the quality of this thing as a DI box may not be as good as a dedicated interface. But again, we're in the budget realm here. I'm not exactly going to nitpick that, and it's going to sound basically inconsequential by the time you put this thing back through its own signal chain. Starting from left to right on the top panel, you have a single guitar input. That's it. This thing does not pretend to be a microphone preamp or anything like that, though you can use it for acoustic, and quite well at that, if I do say so myself, though I wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards this to be a acoustic amplifier. I think it'd sound really good as a line out to a PA, though, and I'll show you why later. Beyond the completely clean acoustic amplifier model, you have a mostly clean, you could push it to be a little dirty, clean model, pushed, crunch, lead, brown, and a separate variation of each one of those. And I believe that variation switch started with the Mark II series. And they're sometimes almost the same, just with a little bit of gain boost, at least that's what it sounds like to me, or maybe a slightly different EQ profile like with the acoustic amplifiers. Other times it is a noticeably different amp sound, as if, for example, the lead kind of goes from a SLO, almost Mark series style preamp sound on the first variation to being what sounds like a rectifier without all the low end on the second variation. And the brown sound is kind of the same way. For, I would say, 4 out of 5 scenarios, there's definitely one of the two that I prefer, and I probably wouldn't even use the other one. But I'm glad they have those because, again, it kind of gives you just a slight variation on the same sort of sounds, whether you want to just change it up for a solo or, you're looking for just that slightly different texture. And that's really where it comes down to for me, is the distortion texture for the higher gain stuff between songs, and it makes a lot of sense. One feature new to the Mark III that I basically recommend you keep on at all times is the bloom switch. Now, this can be really, really subtle on some of the amplifiers to where it sounds like anything even happen, but especially for some of the higher gain stuff and more push dynamic amplifier models, this just sounds so much better to me. It has the kind of hallmarks of a reactive power amp, and I think that's what they're going for, is something that's just a little bit pushed harder in those critical speaker resonant frequencies, and it just makes this thing so much more lively. Again, it's not the difference between buying a Mark II at $225 or buying this at $400. You know, it's not worth that, but it does save you some EQ work, and I think it is just better overall. It's kind of an improvement towards more accurate amp modeling with this whole platform, so I think it's good to have. And again, you'll see most of the demonstrations after I demo this on and off. I'm going to keep it on almost at all times. Beyond the bass, middle, treble, tone stack, this added a contour control. It's just like most of these other controls, gives you a number of presets per channel. So even though you're on the same, let's say channel 1 here, you can turn this between like a yellow, red, and green or off. And each one of those can have their different settings, which is not only like a mode, but you could shift the frequency there. So you can kind of get the Mark Series scoop. You can kind of dial in a HM2 profile if you really try hard enough. And it's very subtle things in between where, you know, just tweaking out some of those garbage frequencies at the desk. You kind of think of it that way, or having like just a subtle scoop EQ somewhere in the loop where you're moving between frequency ranges. So nice to have, especially for higher gain stuff, or if you're trying to kind of emulate a different speaker than you actually have with this thing out loud. Definitely a good feature. Again, with global EQ and other effects, it's not the end of the world if you don't have that. Continuing with volume and EQ adjacent controls, there is a presence and master volume here, and you can even dial in resonance with the Tone Studio software, even though it's not on the panel itself. There is a solo mode now. I believe it started with the Mark II, where you can dial up its own individual solo level per preset, and then once it's engaged, your entire amp should get louder, or you can tie it to a boost in front of an amplifier as well. Think at the same time. Of course, you switch between your different channels here or what's on the panel, kind of pod style. And on the standby switch, which is basically useless on a solid state amp, but I guess it works for the headphones mode, you can go as low as a half watt mode for connectivity to a speaker cabinet, half at 50 watts or maximum at 100 watts. And of course, in this room, I don't need anything over half. I have turned it up to maximum, and it's as loud as a type of solid state amp as you would kind of expect at 100 watts. Though the depth control is not on the panel, the cabinet resonance mode is, and this one is quite powerful in terms of shaping the overall output signature of this thing. It's a little bit more obvious to me when using this in a direct fashion, especially when you pair it with some of the other recording output options you have, but you can still definitely hear this thing is shifting some type of reactivity curve somewhere, where vintage is more in line with your greenback sound, and then modern is a little bit more mid-heavy, but has a little bit of, that low depth to it, and then deep is kind of all focused in the low end. And it does add kind of that last bit of secret sauce to differentiate certain amp models from one another. So if you dial these in kind of together, I think you'll get more different tones out of this than you might have otherwise heard on previous generations. Returning to the effects sections, which we skipped over a moment ago, these all kind of work the same way as Contour, where you can assign 3 different modes for each one per preset. So even though, let's say we're only using the 1 amp on this preset, I can switch between the red, yellow, and green reverb or off, and they'll all be different types of sounds, which is nice. Same deal with all of these. And just because this has effects and delay doesn't mean it has to be, a specific type of effect or even delay. I could make reverb delay 2. There is some cross-pollination that way. I can even put a modulation on effect. I could put a compressor on mod, stuff like that. The only problem with these for me is, besides them having to kind of double stack with these concentric controls to get, everything fit in here, not only does this not cover the entire, effects gamut that is available on this thing, so you're missing, like some pedal effects and stuff that you can't control from this panel. These are only amounts, right? Or effect levels or mixes or whatever this is. You're not turning the drive up on the booster. You're not changing the tone control. You're not changing the rate of the modulation. You're not changing, the time with delay, which that's not a big deal because there's a tap tempo button there. But to really get into some of these critical parameters, you're going to have to use the software anyway. So it kind of misses the point of having some of these things on here. Now, I still feel this is probably a better compromise or a better way of going about it than trying to have all these 5-button combinations like you had on previous Line 6 products, where you had to go to a secret menu, or, okay, press this thing to hold this thing, and now your treble is actually your delay time. I don't want to deal with that either. So in one regard, it's like, okay, it's probably good that they minimized all that junk. But at the same time, there's probably going to be something that I don't know, that you're going to want to pull your phone out or have a laptop hooked up to this thing to just change a little bit in a live environment, because maybe, okay, this delay trail isn't really working now and I want to turn it down, but I still want a little more repeat time, a little bit more feedback. So now, you got to connect to it anyway. And that's stuff that, with a more mature series, something that's for a bit more of the pro crowd, where you can just dive into there, even if it's not the easiest to get to, but you can at least get to the thing and turn it up and turn it down as necessary. That's kind of where this thing starts separating itself from the rest of the crowd. It's like, you can get 90% of the way there, but some of those really, nitty gritty effects parameters, you still have to be connected to this thing, which again, it kind of makes sense to use as a desktop unit at that point. So my main advice would be dial in everything well ahead of time, in rehearsal, and make sure it's ready to go whenever you're either practicing or you're playing out loud. From here on out, you'll primarily be seeing screen captures of the Boss Tone Studio software and the settings that I used for the Katana when reamping all these tracks. But one of the things that you won't see every time, because I've usually kind of kept these consistent between each of the demonstrations, is in the line out settings, which also affects the recording out and headphones out. You can change what really is an impulse response ultimately, though you can't load impulse responses, right? So without using a custom setting, you have a recording, blend, and live kind of preset. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't like any of them. Not out of the box. They're okay. I think it shipped with recording kind of set up out of the box, but what you really want to do, and I wish you could kind of do this per preset, but then again, this kind of turns into a whole different class of gear, is change this to custom settings and dial in your own microphone. Now, you see M1 and M2 and you think, oh, cool, you can blend microphones, but not really. These are just settings that you can flip back and forth to real quickly, which again, better than nothing. I feel like if you're using this as a budget desktop amp modeler for recording at home, you at least have the ability to go between like, okay, here's my rhythm and clean sound, and here's the mic I would use for leads and something else. So there's at least that. There are a number of mic models. You recognize a few of the really popular choices. You have some ambient, like room slapback type of delay that you can dial in there, and the microphone position and distance, at least on one kind of corner of the speaker. And it's quite powerful, and it sounds decent. Now, I look at this and I go, well, if you're going to do that, why not have just impulse response loading? And I'm not even saying be able to choose between a bunch, but like if you got 4 presets or even 8 presets, can you just give us one impulse response slot per? Like just be able to, hold 12 or 16 or whatever on board and then go, okay, now go grab that one for this preset. Again, I kind of get the differentiation, the whole strategy of separating this from their more pro products like the GT series, which does allow you to do that. But at the same time, it starts to put Porsche to shame on the amount of product segmentation that they're running, because I know this thing is capable. Like the software isn't, obviously, but the hardware that's here, they could run a freaking impulse response loader on here. They're doing it right there. It's just not, we can't dive into the guts of it. You're just giving us, these different variations of it, and we're blending between them. So it is frustrating in that way, where it's like, dude, you're so close. And I bet some of the more complicated modeling they have for the amplifier side of things on the GT series and some of their other stuff would be able to work on here. But I get it. Again, there's probably development budgets and other things that I'm not considering. Still, it's better than nothing. I'm glad they at least give you the option to change this stuff, even if it isn't up to the level that I would want. One of the best ways to make the most out of a limited selection of amplifiers is to throw different amounts of frequency content and dynamic range manipulation in front of and after it. And that's exactly what we're going to do here with an exploration of the compressors and EQs that this thing has on board. And just like a lot of the effects models here, once you select one from the effects type dropdown, there's generally a second type drop down where you can select different types of, let's say, phaser models or things like that. And the compressor itself has a number of different algorithms. I'm sure most of these are just like different curves, right? I'm sure that this isn't like an in-depth model of the classic orange squeeze. I'm sure it's just kind of a generalization that you can dial in the sustain and attack afterwards. But for what it's worth, I think it's nice to have a few of these options. And as I would expect, a lot of the boss ones, the ones that are kind of modeled after their own pedal circuits, are among my favorite here. So certainly nothing wrong with that. In the signal chain, of course, you can put an EQ before and after the amplifier. I think you can even move one of these, had to have two in the same chain after the amplifier. There's really no reason to do that. In my opinion, I think you just move it. Once again, demonstrating that the software is a little finicky sometimes, but I think you definitely want to keep one up front. And with that, you can cycle between either a parametric EQ or a graphic EQ. Now, the parametric isn't like the finest thing in the world. You can't dial it into 0.01 hertz or anything, but you can at least make some coarse changes like, 2000, 2500, 3.15, 4000 hertz, 5000 hertz, some of the big frequencies that, more than likely that's the ones you'd be dialing in anyway. And of course, change the Q factor as well. So between all those things, you can kind of replicate any clean boost profile you want to. You can use the graphic EQ to go after a little bit tighter frequency bands, or, do the classic Kerry King type trick, or, nuke one frequency to sound more like Metallica or Dimebag. The classic EQ tricks, all those things still apply here. But again, when you're dealing with a less capable or less extensive, less exhaustive variety of amplifiers, stuff like this becomes much more important to kind of change the flavor a little bit. One of my favorite things that Boss does that I don't really take advantage of because I just have too many damn guitars is their line of pedals that emulate other guitar sounds. And a lot of that is built into this amplifier, once again, making this such a budget-friendly win. Because if you have, let's say, a humbucker-only guitar, well, guess what? There's a pickup simulator on board where you can switch it around and make your humbucker sound like a single coil, or you make your humbucker sound like a hollow body, or you can make your single coil sound like those things, or even an acoustic type guitar. And again, if you're down to only one or two guitars, you can spend less than $400 and get something that makes it at least somewhat sound like on recording you have another one. And it's close enough to where if, let's say, for instance, on my Telecaster, I have the ability to coil split on the bridge pickup, or even my Super Typhoon, I can coil split either. Going back and forth between the same position coil split versus the single emulator, or vice versa, coil split versus the real humbucker or the humbucker mode on here, is almost to the point that it's scary, where it's like it shouldn't be this easy to do that. It shouldn't sound that realistic, and something in my brain tells me there's a difference, but I can't figure out what it is. Whether it's like not enough noise or there's some dynamic thing in there, but they pretty much got it figured out. And I know you could do the same thing more accurately with like impulse responses on Fractal and that sort of thing, but at the same time looking at this and going, well, if they can do it this easily and it sounds that good, like, why can't we just have that as a thing everywhere? You know, come on, Cliff, just give it to us on XFX or Fractal platforms in general. I just want a damn block where I can turn it on and off and not have to waste a cab block for it, stuff like that. But this does a phenomenal job with it. Another mode that's pretty fun to play around with and that I think makes this a good jumping off point for beginner guitarists is the wave synth mode, where you can change between a square and saw wave. Not nearly as extensive as some of the stuff you'd see in more pro units, or especially what Boss has on offer with their own individual pedals that can do this. And I'm sure that was a move that they consciously made. But for monophonic stuff, it can be kind of fun. Not the best with polyphonic, but once again, it's worth playing around with. A cheap expression pedal will allow you to use not only stuff like a pitch bend or a volume pedal, but also a wah pedal as well. And this actually has a number of modes. There's the 95E here, and when you use the regular pedal wah type, it also gives you the Vox, Crybaby, 7-string, Rezo wah, a couple other different, what I presume are, Boss dialed in models here. And they're fine. They're nothing to write home about in my opinion, but for what I'm looking for, 9 times out of 10, it would do the job. It's good enough. I wouldn't go out and buy another one, and gives you, at least some exposure to what a wah pedal sounds like. Though I think maybe they're not nearly as different as one another could be. And of course, without having the realistic impedance feedback like you'd have on some higher end amp modelers, you're not truly getting that real pickup interaction that you otherwise would with a real pedal. But unless you're a real big pedal snob or fuzz snob or stuff like that, when it comes to the way that your guitar interacts with it, this is going to be fine for a lot of players. Speaking of fuzz and other boosts, there are a ton of booster circuits modeled on this thing, from the cleanest to meanest imaginable. You have stuff like, of course, the played out tube screamer, their blues driver. You've got a number of boss models, as you would hope, like the HM2, the Metal Core, the Metal Zone, as well as staples from other manufacturers like the Rat, Distortion Plus, the Governor, the octave fuzzes and big muffs you'd see in the fuzz world, a fuzz face type thing, the Klon Centaur, clean boost, treble boost. I'm assuming that's supposed to be something more like a range master, and the list goes on. And once again, these are all circuits that are modeled well enough that I feel like I could stick this in front of a real amplifier and get really good sounds out of it. And they play well enough with the amps on board here that's like, yeah, I don't feel like you need to go out and buy a Centaur clone to pair with this thing. Again, be kind of a mismatch of value in my opinion anyway. But it's one of those things where it's also like, I feel that maybe the circuit modeling of this is maybe more hampered by the amp modeling in some instances than anything, where stacking the distortion from the pedal on top of a little light overdrive on the amp doesn't quite give the same texture or reactivity or like Velcro type rippy sound that I would like out of real silicon diodes or germanium or even LEDs hard clipping into real tube preamp. But again, really subtle stuff, things that I think for most people that are going to buy this probably haven't even developed the ear to hear those things or really care. So I think it's really fantastic that they have as many of these on board. It's just, again, kind of a pain in the ass that you have to dial all this in ahead of time and not be able to change anything but basically output or drive on the front panel. Looking further into the pitch effects department, not only do you have access to what is essentially a Digitech whammy type thing with the pedal effects here, but there's also a pitch shifter algorithm in the effects and modulation section, which can have up to 2 voices. So you really have a couple different ways to use this. You can kind of have this as a static type detune, almost chorus sound. If you want to go with the 2-voice approach, you can kind of get that shimmery type of 80s, 90s sound, although it's not really stereo. They're both in the center, and it doesn't sound nearly as wide as I think it could otherwise. Again, one of those things, it's like, you've got the processing power. I know you do. Why is this not stereo? Then you have the pedal effects version, which pitch bend is, again, kind of that more, it's not static. It doesn't have to be static. It depends on the pedal position and what you assign to it, but it can go anywhere from -24 to +24. So, 2 octaves up and down. And they sound mostly the same to me. There is a little bit of difference if you use one as kind of like a virtual capo to tune up or tune down your guitar. And I feel like there are some moments of instability depending on how much frequency content you're giving it. Big chords, they sound a little warbly, they sound a little fake. However, unless you're changing pitches all the time, or you need to go between anywhere from E to, like a capoed sound without actually putting a capo on it, or drop down to C major or whatever, I would be hard pressed to recommend going out and buying a pedal to do that exclusively, because if you're just needing this for 1 or 2 songs every now and again, it's probably good enough. It doesn't feel the best to play, but it does the job. And again, if you're switching tunings all the time, there's probably a good case to be made to just go to a whole different platform entirely. But this does some interesting stuff, and I'm glad it is at least on board, even if it's not the best demonstration of having this dynamic pitch capability. As for the more popular wet effects with stuff like modulation, delay, and reverb, the modulation section includes most of what you would expect to have, especially coming from the MD series. There's no dimension here. Here, there's no dimension on the GT series, which is like freaking outrageous. But whatever the case, you can see a lot of things that come from Boss's pedigree of their extensive pedal lines like the slow gear or, their own chorus vibrato sounds. And you can get some pretty lush stereo stuff in here that's model dependent. Not all of it's stereo. In fact, I'd say most of it is not, unfortunately. But a lot of it sounds pretty good. And on top of that, there are specific models of certain things like the flanger and phaser, where you got like the 90E phaser, the 117 flanger. You probably know what those things are alluding to. And of course, other companies' creations like the Univibe and other things that are modeled in here that sound, once again, really good. And I think that, coming from this, from a perspective like what I was trying to discover 20 years ago, this is just so much more logical in terms of what is included on board. And I'd been stoked to hear like the ring mod and rotary coming from this thing when I probably first experienced that just dialing in the wrong preset or going to something like, oh, that sounds terrible. But being able to see it and kind of go through this on a budget entry level type of piece of gear is pretty awesome, because it sounds right up there with the big dogs to me. My passion for chorus is probably only in second place to my pickiness for delay. And I'm at least somewhat happy to say that the Katana has a couple modes on board that are truly impressive. But for the most part, in typical Boss fashion, they don't put everything together in one. And again, it does feel a little contrived because it feels like, well, if you can do a panning digital thing, why can't you just add a little modulation on top? Or why can't you, do a ping pong effect or whatever? It seems like it's all there. It's just an algorithm limitation. And maybe some of it is legitimately processing power, and that I can understand. But, for a lot of this, it's simply not stereo, which is fine. Most of the time, if I'm going to do a tape echo thing, I can understand tape was mono and, a stereo tape emulation is kind of ridiculous. But I love that sound. Most of the time, though, at least they give you a high cut or low cut control to be able to get some of that analog filter in there for stuff that is not that way automatically. You have a modulate version. You got the SDE 3000 emulated quite well with different filters and being able to turn on and off the modulation, things like that. But it's like, I wish this was in stereo still. And of course, with things like the panning sort of ping pong effect, like you can get a wider stereo image. But the real trick out of this for me is that there is this stereo delay. And you go to this at first and go, well, okay, what's the trick here? It's just one side is offset by like plus 100 milliseconds or something. And actually, no, what you're seeing is the direct mix is like one side completely. The effect is one side. And basically what that means is you're only hearing the wet in one ear and out the other ear is the dry signal. You can make this, by extension, a double tracker. If you turn the delay time really low, feedback to 0, no high cut, and you match the effect level, or you can actually turn them up a little bit depending on what that does in your ears, and voila, you've just turned this amp into a double tracked type sound. Although it's not perfect, it's, eventually, at least for me, the static double tracked trick gets old and I no longer hear it as double tracked after a while. But it's pretty slick because you could move this around and get a bit of a wider sound as a result. Now, you can't move it everywhere, again, with where a lot of the times delay 2 is locked in, with reverb and stuff, it's not necessarily going to get you the widest image ever, and some things still collapse to mono or closer to the center of the mix. But especially for rhythm tones, if you're the only guitar player and you've got a couple cabs to play with, it's a pretty neat trick, one I like. While I wouldn't go so far to say the reverb section is uninspired, it just simply isn't as fleshed out as I think it could be. A lot of good controls, a lot of really good sounds where it counts, and I think they've covered a pretty big swath of the reverb palettes that I would normally use. Plate, room, hall, spring, modulate. If I had to pick 5, that's probably it. Something a little more ethereal, something a little more cosmic sounding would be nice, but I know a lot of that comes from, Strymon effects kind of ruining everybody's expectations of how good reverbs should sound. But for the most part, you can get your normal musical guitar player type of reverbs out of this thing. And though, once again, I want some more stereo separation out of these, and that's probably my biggest complaint, they still work quite well with the character of the rest of the amplifiers and effects. I find this video a tough one to conclude because I'm simultaneously left wanting more from this amplifier, seeing so many things that could easily be expanded upon in a hardware update, a Mark IV, or even a complete revamp of the Katana, and making it just like a whole new breath of fresh air, stepping it up to where it wouldn't cost anything really to upgrade its potential, to give it more storage, to have more of these presets on board and make it that much more of a professional heavyweight in disguise. At the same time, after spending the amount of time that I have with it and now yammering about this thing for the better part of an hour and a half, I'm left also a little exhausted because it's not quite the inspirational tool that other hardware modelers have been, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be. I don't expect to plug into every piece of gear, just get some ideas to play stuff. It has been really fun to practice with for stuff that is in the kind of thrash metal level of gain. But for me, I'm a really high gain amp snob, I guess you could say. It's the reason that I own particular types, because they all have some type of pick attack. They all have some type of saturation, some type of frequency response and compression and just overall vibe to them that I feel that none of the amps in the Katana really do for me. And some of it is the output. I know it is because playing through some real cabinets, it sounds really good, but playing through the same real cabinet with a real tube amplifier, you can hear some of the gut punch type of resonance that you get out of some tube amplifiers. It just really isn't here. The preamplifier, scratchy saturation while still retaining a big chunk pick attack, it really isn't here. And I'm not saying, that I hold Boss to the same standard as a Fractal Audio Systems or a Line 6 when it comes to this stuff. They kind of pick their lane, and that's fine. With that, it still is a grand value. There's no contesting that. Like I said, this for, even the Mark II for $300 to $350 at your doorstep. If you're willing to spend, another few $100s on a good 212 cab, you're going to have a blast, I think, especially starting out and with just how many options are at your fingertips to dial in different guitar tones with the same guitar, going between these different pickup simulators and acoustic simulators. I mean, it's like, it's all out there for you. And especially when you pair it with a PC that has something to record to, you really have no excuse to not make your own music. And if you don't like, all the amplifier sounds on here, you would just monitor with this thing and just, throw some VST plugins on top of your other stuff for free. And there you go. You still have a very valid rig for not a lot of money. At the same time, I feel like a lot of people will start developing their ears. They'll start hearing things they like, and they're just going to kind of outgrow some of the higher gain amplifier models on here. I'm not saying you can't find your sound here, or especially that it's not good enough for a live gig. I think for most stuff, it's not going to be the bottleneck in your band whatsoever. And it's no wonder that I've seen so many, just guys playing out for fun with these kind of rigs. However, again, if you have a particular tone in your head that isn't just Tube Screamer through 5150, and even that is a little lacking in some ways in this thing, I do feel like you're going to get bored of it. Because for me, especially without the bloom switch, some of these amp models are just kind of flat. And they're not even pedal sounding to me. They just sound kind of like a old free VST plugin, like several generations old. And not that they sound terrible, they just don't do what I want them to do. And as a consequence, I feel like some of the cleaner or pushed amplifier models in the higher gain area where you start to get some push, you start to get some breakup, those sound really good. And the lead amp models kind of in the middle ground, but being pushed by clean EQ, those sound pretty damn good, especially when paired with a good output sound out of the, custom microphone positions. I wish the brown was a little bit different, and I wish there was just like one more amplifier type. And I know it'd probably be a little bit redundant, but especially for the high gain stuff, I just feel like there's so much they're holding out on this on the GT, because I've heard a couple of those live too, and they sound pretty damn good. So again, I understand the need, at least from a business point of view. I get why they do what they do, but pretty much I can guarantee you that the hardware in this thing is capable of doing a little bit more complex stuff. And I can guarantee you that for another $5, and they can even pass that on to the consumer, or you pass on $25, that this could hold a lot more stuff in it in terms of presets, in terms of models. And it's just, it does feel artificially hampered in that way. Still at the price point, it makes a lot of damn sense. And it's really no wonder to me why this is the best-selling piece of gear right now, and has been for God knows how many years, and it probably will continue to be because of just how much crap is on board. And if you need like a good stepping stone into experiencing a lot of this stuff for the first time, and you have nothing, I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, even this thing has built-in speakers, but you got the combos that have their own speakers that aren't incredible, but they serve the purpose. And unlike a direct floorboard where you may not already own a pair of headphones or auxiliary gear to be able to play through it, this thing is its own rig, and you don't need anything else except for an instrument cable and a power outlet. But then that brings up the other issue of like, well, is it still worthwhile to invest in that platform first, and just eat another $100 or so, and you have way more options? And it really depends on what you want. I think there's really no super wrong answer, but I think if you're just kind of like, I want an amp sound, I want a pedal sound, and you don't care what it says, or you're not going after a particular type of amplifier tone, you're going to be plenty happy with this. But if you're more in the thinking of, well, I don't care if I have to buy another piece of gear down the road to play this out loud, I want it to sound like a freaking 5150, or I want that rectifier model, or I want that plexi model and all the bells and whistles and switches that those things have, you're probably better off looking at the GT line, or especially the Pod Go, or all these other affordable amp modelers out there that do that kind of workflow. And that's the ones I became more interested in. But damn, if this thing isn't scratching a lot of itches that the original Pod series did when it comes to, here's a generalization of this sound. And for the most part, it's really easily accessible, and, take it or leave it. And I can respect that to a certain extent. So what I hope we don't see going forward is like every mark being just this laughably incremental upgrade where it's like, hey, new USB standard, or now you can hold 12 presets instead of 8. And now we've added, one master tone control or something for your, just a little crap like that. Because I know they could take this a lot further. But if it keeps the cost down, maybe they don't need to. I don't know. It's really interesting. It's an interesting piece of gear in that way. Because, like I said, I feel like they could do a lot with not a whole lot of investment. But then maybe it encroach too much on their other business. Maybe it deserves to. I don't know. Let me know what you think. As for other content with this, don't really have anything planned. I really just wanted to check it out and see what all the buzz was about, and see why this was on the best selling of Sweetwater and Guitar Center for so long. And I can say I freaking get it. Again, I'm more of the mindset I'd probably get a multi-effects unit floorboard or plugins and stuff, but starting out, man, I'd love to have this thing. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Any other questions? Of course, you can leave those as well. We'll see you next time. Bye.